Jón Páll Sigmarsson's combination of physical ability and larger-than-life personality made him a true pioneer in the world of strength sports. And his untimely passing was a devastating loss to everyone who knew and loved him. This is the story of Jón Páll Sigmarsson. Born on a farm on the 28th of April 1960, Jón Páll's family moved to Stickish Ulmer when he was 3 years old, where he would enjoy an active and busy childhood. Jón Páll would hunt and help butcher seals and was a hard worker from a young age, carrying water from the well to the family home and helping out with carpentry work. He was also a self-confessed bookworm and was a regular at the mobile library. His favourites were Tarzan stories, Robin Hood, and he also enjoyed reading about the ancient Icelandic heroes. When he was just 5 years old, Jón Páll said that he wanted to be the strongest man in the world, and he started sports young, first playing football and practicing karate, and then he took up Olympic weightlifting when he was 14 years old. Thanks to a mobility issue in one of his arms, Jón Páll switched from weightlifting to powerlifting, and even as a teenager he took his training seriously, choosing to spend Friday evenings in the gym while his friends would go out.
I remember seeing Jón Páll with the Iceland crew, and they were yelling out their Icelandic Viking-like encouragement, which was unbelievable. I'd never seen anything like that before. It stirred your soul. I saw Jón Páll in the hall later on the next day, and a little standoffish, a little reserved, but I wanted to meet them, so I went up and extended my hand to him, and he was the perfect gentleman. And then you got the soft-spoken contrast from that raging Viking that the Icelanders are when they compete, and Jón Páll was the perfect manifestation of that.
During this time, Jón Páll was also working at a hotel, which is where he would meet the mother of his son, Sigmar. He was a loving and attentive father, but travelling to compete meant he wasn't at home with his son as much as he wanted to be, a sacrifice he was making to try and secure his son's future.
And then I saw this young blonde guy with fantastic personality. It was a personality that interested me, how he was, the way I thought a Viking should be. And I thought, well, at that time I was starting to actually organise games, and that to have a guy like him in my games would be a big star attraction.
I am Jón Páll Sigmarsson from Iceland, and I have been traveling further than any other competitor to get here, so I must make every mile count.
1983 was Jón Páll's first appearance at the World's Strongest Man competition, and there he made a huge impression with both his sportsmanship and his impressive performances in the events, which saw him take second place overall behind Jeff Capes.
I'm a little bit crazy. Yes, when I'm competing.
In 1984, Jón Páll also ventured into the world of bodybuilding and would regularly go on to compete in the sport in between the strongman competitions. When competing in strongman, Jón Páll would usually weigh between 130 and 140 kilos and would drop down to roughly 105 kilos for the bodybuilding stage. He held himself to a ridiculously high standard and wanted to be the best in everything that he did. This was evident in the top 10 strongman competitions, when Jón Páll was so angry at himself for being unable to complete the wheelbarrow carry, he kicked a hole through the screen behind him.
Look at this!
Well, we are looking at it, and it's going aloft.
A new type of man on the block, you know, it wasn't the static, ugly, I'm just strong, you know. I competed against him for many years after that, but it was always the tussle between the mad Icelander and me, you know what I mean? And I felt like his grandfather, you know.
And it's the best so far, 9 feet, 10.5 inches.
Such was Jón Páll's influence at the time, he even played a role in introducing skier to Scotland.
People used to ask Jón Páll, how can you look so great? What do you eat to look so great? And he would say, well, I eat the skier, because people didn't know what skier was.
Og ég sé ekki betur þessi mynd að þeir sjálfum þannig þannig?
Jú, þetta kunningi minn sem heitir Douglas Edmunds, röðumur mikill, halvur rússi.
Heldur að þetta sé merkaði fyrir þetta?
Já, hann selur tonn á viku núna.
Tonn á viku, já?
Já.
Jón Páll trained hard for his second appearance at the World's Strongest Man, which would take place in Sweden in January of 1984. One event that really required a lot of work was the caber toss, which he would train with Dr. Douglas Edmunds himself during many trips to Scotland.
As well as having the throwing events, we introduced new events like Farmer's Walk and Stones of Strength and the Glashing Stones. They were introduced into the Highland Games so that people could see what Jón Páll could do. In the meantime, I trained them in the power events in the Highland Games. So we spent many days in a farm down by my house teaching them how to toss the caber, and eventually he learned, and he learned very well. So I thought it must be a terrible blow to Jeff, who has been tossing caber for many years before that this new guy from Iceland beats him at one of his favourite events.
I'll never forget the time when he did beat me, and he says, "The king has lost his crown."
The king has lost his crown, roars Jón Páll.
That upset me, you know what I mean? So I just go home and train a bit more and just get a bit more mean, you know, and come out again. And I think I said, the king isn't dead, long live the king, you know.
Look at the timekeeper, has he done it? The king is not dead! Yes, would you believe it? 1 minute 57.9, he's come back, second place enough. Title his again, the one he merely loaned out for the year to the man who sportingly raises the arm of the new champion.
After losing his title to Jeff Capes in the 1985 competition, the back and forth between Jón Páll and Jeff would continue when he won his second title in 1986.
I have a very big problem over there. 170 kilos of problem. Jeff Capes.
Kazmaier, for me, was the greatest strongman ever. He looked great, he was great, and he had a sort of fantastic personality for a strongman. So Kazmaier was my personal icon. But Kaz stopped competing in World's Strongest Man, I think, in 82. And then Jón Páll came along, so they never actually met each other at that point. Then, of course, there was Jeff Capes, who had a constant battle with Jón Páll. Sometimes Jeff would win, sometimes Jón Páll would win. So that was an ongoing battle anyway. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could bring Kazmaier together with Jón Páll and Capes and have a big shootout in the Highlands somewhere to find who was the strongest man that ever lived. When I got the three guys together in a restaurant in Glasgow prior to this contest, there's always an argument, of course, about what the events are. I says to Kaz, well, you tell me what you want to have in. And I says to Capes, you tell me what you want to have in. And then I said to Jón Páll, what events would you like to have? And Jón Páll turned to me and says, I don't care what the events are, I'm going to win anyway.
Jón Páll won 8 out of 10 events.
Yes, it's going up. Well, how far can he take it? Over 250 pounds.
I think it's important to say that probably this is the greatest competition that has ever took place, together with the three men. And these three men, myself included, Kazmaier and Jón Páll Sigmarsson, are the three greatest strongmen of all time.
To be alive if you can't do that.
Ever the showman. He really is incredible. Jón Páll Sigmarsson.
The heroes of your day that you remember. I will remember always Capes, Kazmaier and Sigmarsson. These are the men that stick in my memory because they were pioneers They were pivotal figures, so I think that apart from being my favourite, I think that they had a very, very important role to play in strength athletics, because they were the heroes that made everybody start watching television.
Sigmarsson wants to go even higher. 1,153 pounds. It's up there. It's another good lift. We could be here all day.
1988 was the first year that Jón Páll and Kaz went head-to-head at the World's Strongest Man, and it was neck and neck right to the very end when Sigmarsson would ultimately come out on top.
Yes! Hello, Kazmaier, he says. Has he gone for too heavy a weight? No, he's made it, and I think that look is meant for Jón Páll.
Man, we all love Jón Páll Sigmarsson. I didn't have to like him, but I loved what he did. And the position that he took to be the best champion maybe there ever was, for surely the best Icelandic strongman ever.
It's there! What an absolutely fantastic performance. And surely now, there can be no doubt whatever that Jón Páll Sigmarsson richly deserves the title of the world's strongest man.
Ég er að innrétta húsnæði undir líkamsræktarstöð sem verður opnað eftir rúma viku.
The gym that Jón Páll opened started out as apartments, and all of the smaller rooms needed knocking through. It was a time-consuming job and an expensive investment, but it was one that Jón Páll was determined to see through, as he considered the gym an investment into his son's future.
Ég var að keppa út í Århus í Danmörku og einmitt í bílveltu, ég var að velta lötu. Ágætis bifreið, en þar sleit ég.
The injury wasn't Jón Páll's only health concern at the time. He told his partner that he had high cholesterol and blood pressure, and he would get it looked into the next time he travelled overseas. He was reluctant to visit a doctor in Iceland where everyone knew who he was.
Jón Páll Sigmarsson, Odie Wilson, on your march and get set!
Jón Páll became the first man to win the World's Strongest Man 4 times when he took the title again in 1991.
I told you all the time! I told you! I bloody told you!
At the time, he was considered the greatest strongman of all time and was credited with developing Iceland's national identity.
Hann sterkari en ég hélt.
Bókin Jón Páll, Reykholt.
Companies were desperate for him to endorse their products. He would regularly receive fan mail from around the world, and he developed close and lasting friendships in the world of strength sports. Life in general was good for the 32-year-old Icelander.
Þetta var þannig að ég kem á vakt. Jón kemur fljótlega eftir. Og hann segir mér, ég veit ekki, ég ætla að fara og taka restöðliftu.
Við vorum að fara að æfa saman í restöðliftu, laugardagsmorgni, og gerðan sjónvarpið datt út, þannig að hann ætlaði að hita upp og meðan ég hljóp upp og ætlaði að koma sjónvarpinu í lag.
Jón satt á bekk fyrir fornin, hann var ekki búinn að taka sína lyftu. Hann var dottið af bekknum. Mér var í fersku minni aðkoman að syni mínum sem hafði farið á sama veg.
Þegar ég kem á honum þá liggur hann og það engin hjartsláttur og ég tók þarna þátt í vonlausum tilraunum við að reyna að líka með.
Jón Páll had died of an aortic rupture, which was likely the result of a congenital heart defect. The press coverage of his death largely fixated on steroid use, which was particularly hard on his grieving family.
Mikið fjölmenni var við útför Jóns Pálls Sigmarssonar kraftlyftingamanns en hann var jarðsunginn frá Hallgrímskirkju í dag. Lyftingamenn víðsvegar úr heiminum komu til landsins til að fylgja til grafar þessum sterkasta manni heims.
It wasn't as if it was a family funeral, it was as if there was a nation's funeral. You know yourself that the cathedral wasn't big enough to hold all the people. And it's almost like a state funeral with the flags, big white coffin. The way it was done, you know, it was very, very emotional for me. And with the national choir singing, for example, It sounds like angels from heaven rather than just people singing in the church.
I got the call to say that Jón Páll had died. And I said the stupidest thing. I said, "You're joking, you must be joking." Now, who jokes about death like this, you know? It was a silly thing to say. But I couldn't believe. I thought it was somebody trying to, but it wasn't. It was true. And immediately I finished my trip to Spain and came back and, of course, went to the funeral in Iceland. Very sad.
When I got the news from Europe that Jón Páll, at just 32 years of age, had passed in a heavy workout in the gym, I sat down for a minute and thought, well, here's a man who's done so many great things for the country, for the sport, and in his awesome performances. What a way to go, to have a heavy weight in his hand and fall and his heart to stop. He was doing the thing he loved when he left the earth. We miss him greatly, and anytime any of the strongmen talk about Jón Páll Sigmarsson, they talk about his jovial attitude, his wonderful sense of humor. Each and every Icelandic person should be proud to have known and have had a person like him, to be born in Iceland and to fight for Iceland and do the great things he did. Many great strongmen have come since Jón Páll, and all look up to him as if he's on a pedestal. He's up above, looking down and watching, and he knows that each time athletes are doing a celebration of strength, we honor him.
I am the strongest! I am the Viking! Yes!